Okay, everybody. So today we want to talk a little bit about the MGM tape, and then we're going to get into just kind of structural things within the music industry in general. And the MGM tape, why do I keep playing this over and over and over again? Because their narrative is that Orlando Anderson is standing there, a Southside Crip, in a sea of 1,000 bloods, all alone. And Trayvon Lane comes over, whispers in Tupac's ear. Tupac goes tearing after him, beats him up, and then Orlando Anderson is pissed off, comes back, and blasts Tupac on the strip. That's the narrative. And so the way they make it sound is that Orlando Anderson is all alone and that Tupac just happens upon him, and they make it sound like there's nothing else going on behind the scenes there. And we know that Michael Moore's getting phone calls from Reggie up in his room, making sure that Michael Moore's not down there, because this would have never happened if Michael Moore was there, because Michael Moore's got his gun on him. And it's just not going to jump off if there's somebody that's there that has a gun. And that's why the guns have to be collected. And so we see this MGM tape. There's an operation that's going on. We have uncovered an operation, a cop-oration, because these are corrupt cops that are in this MGM video. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. And that's why I play it over and over and over again, because this is so central to the Orlando Anderson Did It theme. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. And so you'll see this stuff over and over and over again. And it's the corrupt Compton police that are involved in this. And as I said in a previous video, there's instances of people that come out and see the corrupt Compton police working off-duty security for MGM on fight nights. And we know that MGM hired people from Compton, gang experts. And who are the people that are working there? They're gang experts. Greg Kading's a gang expert. Bobby Ladd's a gang expert. Tim Brennan, Reggie Wright Sr., they're all gang experts. Kevin Gaines, gang expert. They're all gang experts. So they're working off-duty security, and that's how they collect the tape and what have you. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. But today, I kind of wanted to talk a little bit about the actual music industry and about Compton in general. Now, I've been to Compton well over 2,000 times. During COVID, I was there every single day, and I was there sometimes multiple times within a day. Sometimes I'd be in a backyard in Compton, and I've been working, editing, and whatnot down there till like 2 o'clock in the morning, and just ready to pack up and leave. And just as I'm packing up, we hear gunshots, and it's like, can't leave now. Those gunshots sounded pretty close. And then you hear the retaliation gunfire. And then you hear the police sirens. Then you hear the helicopters. And, after things kind of die down a little bit, then it's okay to leave. And you leave Compton, 2, 3 o'clock in the morning. And so there have been a lot of those kind of situations down there. But while I've been down in Compton, I probably met about 500 people, different people, that have all told me stories. And some of them relate to, the Southside Crips and who hung out with them, and the fact that the Patton brothers hung out with them, the fact that Little Half Dead hung out with them and would show up at parties. And I've talked to other people who talked about the corrupt Compton PD. I've had a building structure pointed out to me where I was told that the Compton PD had prostitution that was happening there. I've been told that the 5th floor of the hotel was prostitution, and it was controlled by the corrupt Compton PD. And I've also been told about the drug trafficking. and about DA reject cases that the drugs just go missing out of the evidence locker. There's 6 police helicopters down there. The air guy is a guy named Newsman, and he's also the head of the gang unit. And that the gang unit would be who's, running the drugs and whatnot, and the narcotics unit. They all work together. And Newsman gets hemmed up in a case, and it's right at the time that there's other stuff going on at the Compton PD, and there's testimony that needs to be coerced and whatnot, and that's how these guys work. They coerce testimony because they're so busy running the illicit businesses that it's shoddy police work on the other businesses. And that's what you find with detectives like Greg Kading. He's so busy doing the shady stuff that his actual police work is shoddy. And when Russell Poole got all of Rafael Perez's case files, basically it was copy-paste stuff. He had just copied and pasted from one file to another, and it was the exact same testimony. Like completely no police work was actually going on. And all of Rafael Perez's cases should have been overturned. Billions of dollars should have been paid out on those Rafael Perez cases. But it's not just Rafael Perez. It's every Greg Kading case should be overturned. Every Nino Durden case should be overturned. Every David Mack case. Every Kevin Gaines case. Every Reggie Wright Jr., Reggie Wright Sr. case. Every Tim Brennan, Bobby Ladd case should be overturned. Those guys were part of the corrupt Compton Police Department, and that department was shut down. They sued. They tried to get the police department to be overturned, that whole thing, and they lost. So, it's adjudicated that this was a corrupt police department. And how were they corrupt? Well, they were corrupt in drug trafficking, money laundering, gun running. They were running prostitution, according to Compton people down there. So I was asked if that's Bobby Ladd in the MGM in a comment. And I figure I should just address that publicly. I would just say this. There are a number of people in Compton who have told me that that's Bobby Ladd. And these are people that know him. Now, I would love to see him sitting in the hot seat, being interviewed under oath and asked about that. And that's how we're going to find out. We need to interview Reggie Wright Sr., Reggie Wright Jr., Bobby Ladd, and whoever else we can that looks like they were there at the time, and get them under oath and ask them questions about it. And either they're going to plead the fifth or they're going to answer about it. And that gives us a baseline for what to do with this. Now, let's talk about the music industry. When you make a pact with the devil, he always comes back to get his due. And we want to talk about Suge Knight today, okay? Tupac said, unless we share with each other, we got to start making changes. Learn to see me as a brother instead of two distant strangers. And that's how it's supposed to be. How can the devil take a brother if he's close to me? I'd love to go back when we played as kids, but things changed. And that's just the way it is. And y'all are Suge Knight haters. And I just say, don't hate the player, hate the game. Don't hate the player, hate the game. You got to know the rules. And the rules are, you got to pay to play. You got to pay to play. Drug trafficking, money laundering, prostitution, gun running, all that stuff, illicit business is happening, and you got to pay to play. And one thing that we know for sure is that when it comes to Eazy-E, he was pretty straight up about it. He said, hey, I used drug profits to start this record label. He said that while he was alive, and it was pretty straight up. Now, the debate really has surfaced lately. I mean, we used to believe that it was Michael Harry O'Harris that provided the $1.5 million to start Death Row. And now it's come up that it might be Pat Johnson that provided some of that money. But the truth of that is that these guys were in prison at the time, and that money had come from drug profits to start the record label, and it was cash. I was at a Lee Baca fundraiser when he got hemmed up in his federal case. He threw a fundraiser in Santa Monica, and I met the guy who actually handed that grocery sack full of the money to Suge Knight and David Kenner. And he told me that story. And it's crazy to me that he would be at a sheriff fundraiser and he's the guy that handed in the cash. And that's how we see that there's really blurry lines when it comes to the police, the music industry, and especially Death Row Records and the drug trade. So drug money begins a record label. Now, why would you need cash to run a record label? Well, let's turn to the Harvard report, because the Harvard report discusses payola. And the Harvard report was around 72, and it was about the expansion of soul music, and Columbia Records wanted to get into that business. And they wanted to get into what would morph and become hip-hop and rap. And it had its birth out of the soul and the soul music. And the Harvard report discusses payola. Now, why did they discuss payola? They say, oh, this is highly illegal, it shouldn't be done. And then they talk about it as a practice that happens in the music industry. Now, Suge Knight did not invent payola. Payola existed all the way back to the beginnings of the music industry, the modern music industry. Now, if all of your competitors embrace payola, then you probably should too, if you want to be in that business. If you want to be in the music business and your competitors embrace payola, you're probably going to have to embrace payola too. And that was the industry that Suge Knight was coming into. But we know that when you make a pact with the devil, he always comes back to get his due. And Tupac said, and still I see no changes. Can a brother get a little peace? There's a war in the streets and a war in the Middle East. Instead of war on poverty, they got a war on drugs, so the police can bother me. And I ain't never did a crime I ain't have to do. And now I'm back with the facts, giving 'em back to you. Don't let 'em jack you up, back you up, crack you up, and pimp smack you up. You gotta learn to hold your own. And so here I am. I'm giving facts back to you. This is a scandalous world that we live in. And music's perhaps the worst of all the businesses with ties to illicit cash businesses. Concerts equals drug users. Late nights equals drug users. Music tours are Learjets transporting the artists around, but it's also an opportunity to transport and distribute narcotics. And the drug industry creates piles of cash, and that cash needs to be laundered. Other industries create piles of cash that also need to be laundered. Prostitution, gun running, extortion, murder, bank robbery. That money needs to be cleaned, laundered, washed, and come back in the form of legitimate businesses. So, back to Compton. In 1992, there were 150 massage parlors in Compton, and those are being run by the corrupt Compton Police Department. Compton's also known as the Hub City, and there's 6 police helicopters for a city of 10 square miles. And drugs, prostitution, gun running, They're all done by the corrupt Compton police. And in 95, the Gary Webb articles are dropped. Can you imagine being inside Death Row Records when the Gary Webb articles drop and you are seeing the cash that's running around, the drugs running around, and Gary Webb articles? You had to sit back and think if maybe some of the people that were involved weren't somehow connected to the CIA. And when we look at it, nothing really happens with this whole inquiry into Death Row Records. They're criminal, it's a criminal business according to LAPD, but nothing really happens. And they detail in the Gary Webb articles that the American CIA is putting drugs out on the streets of America, including crack cocaine, and they're raising money for covert activities, and they also have as their goal to destroy the black family in America. And they did a pretty good job of it, to be honest with you. I mean, there's a lot of dysfunction now because of all of that crack cocaine that was being foisted upon the community in places like Compton and South Central. Now, Detective Gordon Martins told us that there's a drug ring between San Diego, Las Vegas, and Los Angeles, but it's being run out of Compton. Those were his exact words. So, Suge Knight didn't create this reality. And if you look at the CIA Contra stuff, that goes back into the 80s, the Bolin Amendments and whatnot, the Reagan's war on drugs. That goes back into the 80s. So Suge Knight did not create this reality. He had a desire to start a record label, and this was the baseline at the time. There was payola that was happening at the time. So he came into a scandalous industry, and he made a choice that he was going to play the game. Don't hate the player, hate the game. And I'll just give you a little bit of my personal kind of background. I met Joe Isgro in the 80s when he was under federal indictment. I met him in Las Vegas as I was traveling through. And then I worked for Doc McGee on a Bon Jovi project. And at the time, Doc McGee was under federal indictment for drug trafficking. So those are two music insiders that predate Suge Knight's involvement in music. So the drug trafficking, money laundering was happening even back then. Now, Joe Isgro beat his payola case just like Suge Knight beat the entire inquiry into the illegal activities at Death Row Records. So after years of investigation, Kevin Hackey, federal informant, Reggie Wright Jr., federal informant, there's 3 convictions, all for evasion of taxes. Suge Knight, David Kenner, and Anthony Brooklier. And as an aside, I also was social with Anthony Brooklier. He and I used to hang out on Saturdays in Century City listening to music at the mall. And, I would have get-togethers there, and he would come over and hang out. And he was a nice guy. And by the way, Anthony Brooklier is no longer with us, apparently from a suicide by hanging in his condo in Century City. So those guys, David Kenner and Anthony Brooklier, both pleaded to 1995 tax charges, and they got sweetheart plea deals where they both got to keep their bar cards and continue to practice law. And the source of the Suge Knight plea on a tax charge was Reggie Wright Jr., and he came out and talked about going down to the feds to take the tax charge plea with Suge Knight. He accompanied him down there, and Suge Knight signed his plea deal. And it's crazy to me how Suge Knight doesn't know that Reggie is a federal informant, and the federal informant is accompanying him to go down and sign his plea deal. Now, is that even legal? Is that entrapment? I mean, it just seems like every time we look at Suge Knight, his whole Tams case, his whole case of One Oak, Every card that is ever dealt to Suge by the system is dealt to him by from the bottom of the deck. Every card is dealt from the bottom of the deck. So, but the real question comes to, why do these charges always seem to melt away when it comes to death row records, drug trafficking, money laundering, illicit activities, all that stuff? Why does it melt away? Because there's a lot of evidence of it. There's people talking about it that, are on the record talking about it. Kevin Hackey talks about how Reggie ran the drug trafficking out of Compton. How is a federal informant running drug trafficking in Compton? I mean, it really defies logic. But maybe it's like the Kelly Jamerson murder at the El Rey Theater. They knew who did it, but it simply implicated too many people. The crime was too big to bust, just like the big banks were too big to fail, and perhaps it would have interrupted too many people's cash flows. Perhaps it would have been too big of a glimpse into how shit really works in America and in the world. So today we're going to try and make sense of it with the music industry. Now, record labels make legitimate money. They sell records and they book those sales and they pay expenses like any other company. But when they need to pay out expenses in cash with no receipts, they're going to get into hot water with auditors, with IRS, with local taxing authorities if they don't have a paper trail. They always want to have a paper trail on cash in legitimate businesses, especially receiving cash in legitimate businesses, but also paying out cash. Now, we remember hearing Sharitha talk about not leaving a paper trail. And we also remember that Death Row Dave talked about unbelievable amounts of cash floating around Death Row Records at the time. There was cash everywhere. So we know there was cash. Now, I told you that I met the guy and he handed a grocery sack of cash to David Kenner and Suge Knight. Now, why would you need cash in a record label? Well, it comes back to the payola. But we also know that there's a legitimate side and that there are advances being given to Death Row Records on publishing deals and on distribution deals. So, to be fair, the money to begin Death Row Records really came from advances given by Interscope, but it also came from cash given by the drug dealers that were incarcerated at the time. And in the music industry, what is it that you really need the cash for? And I call it the little packets of cash company. You got to pay people that control playlists. So let's talk about that. What's a playlist? A playlist is at a radio station. The radio stations decide what's going to be played. You got people listening to the radio, and they start talking about some hot new song, and then they drop it, they play it. And then it gets into the rotation, and it's played over and over and over again. And then when the album's available, people run out and buy it. Well, in order to get something played over and over and over again, and how it worked in the 80s was the program director at the radio station would go out and pick up his newspaper in the morning, and in it would be a packet of cash, what I call a little packet of cash, and I don't know how much it was. Maybe it was $5,000, maybe it was $10,000, maybe it was $500. I don't know what the numbers were. But there's a little packet of cash and a list of the songs that the program director is supposed to put into the rotation and play that day or that week. And they do the rotation, the playlist, and they include those songs and they put that cash in their pockets. Well, the other people that you've got to pay little packets of cash to are the people that control the shelf space, the retailers. Because you got to ship those albums, and they're now sitting on the shelf so that people can come and purchase those albums. And there are people that control what gets on the shelf, And those guys get little packets of cash. They get payola. Well, then you got people that control the charts. And if something debuts at number one, it's going to have a much higher success ratio. And if it debuts at number one, it has shelf space, so the albums are on the shelf, and it's getting airplay on the radio stations, then that's going to be a home run. And if the music is really good, then that's also going to propel it to have legs. And Suge Knight was responsible for making sure that the music was really good, and we'll get into that in a minute. Now, this all morphs into gotta pay the police. The Rampart Scandal cops had cash like you can't believe. Selected DAs had cash, and probably selected judges, because they have to call up from time to time and make a case go away. And that was part of what we learned from the Gary Webb stuff, was that people were getting arrested, but because they had their ties to the CIA, there were phone calls being made like, hey, you got to release this person. We're working on something bigger. It has national security interests, so you got to release this. And that's how we found out about this stuff, was through court documents out of San Diego. What did Gordon Martin said? He said it was a drug ring from Las Vegas to Los Angeles to San Diego, and that drug ring emanated out of Compton. And so that means the police are involved in this stuff. And with these little packets of cash that get paid, now we have perception being reality. So if a song is released at number one out the gate, it's going to have legs. If the song's really good, it's going to continue to have momentum and make a lot of money for the record label. Now, it could be that Suge Knight was not expected to have such an impact with this record label, because it's drug money that starts it. It's really a front company, and now it starts to have success, and it's starting to take over the entire music industry. And that is problematic for a lot of reasons, because if you got the little packets of cash company and the record label drawing too much attention to the record label, could have an impact on the little packets of cash company. And if you got the little packets of cash company that's working in conjunction with Death Row Records, well then why not just include the little packets of drugs company? And it's a way for you to pay the artists, it's a way for you to pay the technicians, and it's a way for you to deal with late night bumps that are needed in the music industry. Now, the legitimate music company is run by Suge, and he says he runs it as he would run a football team. Training, 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 getting ready for game day, getting ready for the Super Bowl. He hires artists, he hires technicians, he hires marketing people. And they've got a little bit of an edge, and that is they are soliciting that demo tapes be sent in to the record label because they're looking for the next talent. Well, they're not really looking for the next talent, and Suge Knight says it. He says he gives props to Eazy-E because Eazy-E created this. And what they do is they get demo tapes sent in from all over the country, all over the world. And when those demo tapes arrived, they go through them, they listen to them. If they hear something that sounds unique, fun, exciting, good lyrics, good beat, they rip it off. They get it, the demo tape, they look at it. Dre redoes the beats, the DOC redoes the lyrics in the early days of Death Row, and that's the song. And Suge says, I stole that from Eazy-E, and I took it to a new level, which he did. So Suge Knight is taking this to a whole new level, and that's a great thing because there's cash flow coming in, but it's also a bad thing. And why is it a bad thing? because it's drawing too much attention to Death Row Records. And I say again, don't hate the player, hate the game. So when I was doing the initial investigation with Russell Poole, Russell told me that Suge Knight was behind the murder of Tupac and that Suge Knight was behind the murder of Biggie Smalls. And when you look at the murder of Tupac, it would be impossible to get a conviction of Suge Knight in the murder of Tupac Shakur, because Suge Knight was sitting with Tupac in the car when the shots ring out. And so impossible to get a conviction that Suge Knight is behind the shooting. Impossible. And in the Who Killed Tupac, they actually hire a marksman to try and shoot up the car without shooting Suge, and the marksman fails miserably. And Randall Sullivan looks a little bit ridiculous, him saying that Tupac's murder has been orchestrated by Suge Knight, especially when they tried to get a marksman to shoot Tupac without hitting Suge. Now, there's this whole debate about whether or not Suge was hit with a bullet fragment or he was hit with glass. And that's something that I think emanates from Kevin Hackey, my understanding. And you look at Kevin Hackey and all this. Where's Kevin Hackey? He is a Compton school police. Okay, school is kind of a early morning until 3 p.m. kind of thing in most of America. And it's a Monday through Friday thing in most of America. And I'm not saying that there aren't some Saturday classes, but for the most part, if you're in the school police, and you're working Saturday night, I mean, it really doesn't make sense. And he's got Frank Alexander's radio with him. Now, we don't really know whether or not he was in the entourage with the feds, listening in on the radio, but it kind of makes sense. I mean, why would you keep the radio? Well, there were other people that have talked about listening in on those Nextel radios and hearing the Gotham come over the radio and don't say nothing over the radio. So there were a number of people that were listening in on those radios, and it might make sense that the federal informant that's trying to take down Suge Knight and Death Row Records is listening in on what's going on in Vegas. So the whole debate of whether or not Suge was hit with glass or a bullet fragment, I think is kind of ridiculous, and we shouldn't waste our time on foolishness like that. All that foolishness is there to just distract us from the real facts of the case. Suge Knight says he's got a .45 bullet itched in his skull. He was there. There was blood spurting out of his head. It makes sense that he was actually hit with a bullet or a bullet fragment, and I think we should just leave it at that and take him at his word. These folks that are trying to distract you with this, they are trying to demean and diminish Suge Knight in all of this. So, any conversation of Suge Knight being convicted of killing Tupac is senseless. It's ridiculous. And we shouldn't engage in it because it's impossible to ever get a conviction of Suge Knight for the Tupac murder. Now, when it comes to the Biggie murder, it's a little bit more complex, but it's kind of the same thing. There was a gentleman who reached out to me just the other day, and yeah, I'm sure I'm being recorded when he's talking to me on the phone, but he's the guy who was behind the actually getting the searches of the death row offices being made, because he was in Mule Creek with Suge Knight. Now let's keep in mind that Russell Poole had bugged Suge Knight's cell, and none of the recordings of what happened inside of Suge Knight's cell ever came to anything. Nothing was ever discussed that's salient, and that's from Suge Knight's cell. So this same person talks about how at Mule Creek he was with Suge Knight, and Suge Knight was coordinating these hits on a cell phone. Well, we know cell phones were used in the killing of Biggie, and they were used to coordinate, and it was likely Rafael Perez, David Mack, and Amir Muhammad all on cell phones with the movements. And the cell phone that was one of the cell phones that was used was in the name of Wayman Anderson, which is how he gets into this case. And the story goes that Suge Knight was the one that coordinated the hit from his cell at Mule Creek. The only problem with that is that Suge wasn't at Mule Creek. Suge was in LA County Jail at the time. And what we know about Suge in LA County Jail, because Russell and I had interviewed somebody who was there with him in jail at the time, and he was shackled hand and foot. He couldn't have even had his hand up to his ear at the time coordinating a hit on a cell phone. And back then, things were a little bit different than they are today. Cell phones inside a prison are a little bit more commonplace today. But cell phones back then also didn't have the kind of reception that they do today and all that concrete. It would have been difficult for Suge Knight to ever coordinate this. And once Russell Poole realized that, he no longer thought he could get a conviction on Suge Knight. He also began to realize that there was an important break inside of Death Row Records and that there was a coup d'etat that was in place. And that's part of what we get from the confession letter. So it would be impossible to convict Suge Knight of Biggie Smalls' killing. Now, there are people who talk about how Suge had said he wanted to kill Biggie. There are, that's all hearsay. Not a lot of corroborating witnesses about that. But I can just say this, it would be very difficult to get a conviction on Suge Knight for killing Biggie. Now, did he take credit for it up at Mule Creek when he got up there? It's likely that he did, but Suge Knight took credit for a lot of things he didn't do. And one thing we know, Vanilla Ice was never dangled over a ledge with by his ankles. I mean, you ever tried to, even holding a little kid by their ankles is difficult. And so I know Suge was big and bad and tough and all that, but grabbing somebody by their ankles and holding them over a balcony while they're moving and flitting about, that's something that likely never happened, and it's just folklore. So if we're not going to get a conviction on Suge in either the Tupac or the Biggie murders, let's not waste energy going after Suge for these crimes. And why is it that they want to hand Suge Knight these two murders under the table, which is the story that's being given now by the sheriffs and by prosecutors, that they knew they really couldn't get Suge on the Terry Carter murder, so they handed him two murders under the table, and that's how he got his 28 years. And they did it because Suge Knight is the boogeyman. Suge Knight's also the guy who understands how shit really works. He understood who the Compton PD were. He didn't really like police. He didn't really associate police. He tried to stay away from police. But he had a healthy respect for them. And he did turn the industry on its ear over getting these guys compromised and corrupted. And he probably knows who all the corrupt people are in LA. And that's likely why he's in prison now, being handed two murders under the table. So Death Row Records has become the single greatest intersection of the streets and legitimate business. There's a division inside Death Row Records. And as I said before, Russell couldn't understand that there was a difference between Suge Knight and Death Row Records until he realized that there was a coup d'etat happening inside of Death Row Records. So what's Las Vegas? Las Vegas is the not little packets of cash company, it's the big packets of cash company. And especially back then, huge amounts of cash could be laundered in Las Vegas. Huge amount of cash could be stored in Las Vegas inside those casinos. And it's a perfect place for payoffs, to bring in drug money, store drug money. And that's why Las Vegas becomes an important part of this drug ring that emanates out of Compton. And that means the ties between Las Vegas and Compton PD are very strong. And we see it in the MGM tape. These are Compton PDs in the MGM tape. And we'd like to see them under oath explaining that whole thing away. We want to see them under oath, and we want to be able to ask them the tough questions, because there are things going on in Las Vegas and Compton. And as Gordon Martin says about Las Vegas, it's all about money. And you can get whatever you want in Las Vegas as long as you have money. And he said it's likely that the police were involved in the murder of Tupac. The police were involved in the murder of Tupac because there was money there. And now we see the Keefe D case, and who's his attorney? His attorney is the son of the former mayor, who is a mob attorney, and that just shows us that they want to wall off this case. They want to wall it off so that it doesn't lead to the implication of some of the corrupt cops that were there. They had no intention of ever solving the case. That's going to come out at trial if it goes to trial. So that attorney has been hired by Keefe D, and it's about controlling the narrative and walling off the case. And you see it with LAPD too, with the Rampart Scandal. Who is it that becomes police chief after Bill Bratton? Bill Bratton's brought in with a consent decree by the feds. He comes in from New York, and he's the one that killed the Russell Poole HBO deal, because they did not want that to come out. But then who takes over for him? It's Police Chief Charlie Beck, who's involved in cleaning up the Rampart Scandal. And then who comes in after Charlie Beck? Michael Moore comes in after Charlie Beck. Why? Because he was the one that was actually in charge of Rampart at the time all this corruption happened. So they have to wall things off and have people that are involved. Eric Garcetti becomes the mayor. Why? Because Gil Garcetti was the district attorney at the time all this crazy shit happened. And who goes over and takes over the sheriffs for a while? Well, it's Jimmy McDonnell. And Jimmy McDonnell is the one that shows Phil Carson the Biggie murder books, and Phil Carson witnesses that information is being purged from those murder books. Even that many years later, he witnesses it. So they got to keep the narrative alive, and they got to wall things off. And that's why we see what we're seeing now, because cops are involved in these murders. More later.
You know, so we got a lot to cover up.
So guys,
What's going on?
Greg Kading is out. His lawyer won't let him do it, so
we've been waiting around for Kading all day, and
yeah, and now
he's not
he's a
coming.
no-show.
Really, I wanted to talk to him because there's so much to ask him.
Yeah.
Puffy was going up the stairs, and he said, I don't care if Tupac died, I don't care if Biggie gotta die, and I don't care if Suge gotta go to prison for the rest of his life.
We got a confession letter on how everything went down and who's responsible.
Now, getting back to Russell was following in the footsteps of his dad, and he was able to work through the LAPD and have all the things that had to be done within the LAPD He certainly knew the streets very well, and circumstances in his case were far more tragic because he was killed in the line of duty.
If that's the case, did Tupac life mean anything? Because they never saw that case. Sometimes if you saw the first case, you might have saw the second case. But that never happened, correct?
Yep.
But he did testify reluctantly. The Death Row Records security chief Reggie Wright Jr. once told him, quote, "We're going to get those mothers who downed Pac."
Ice and I, we've heard consistently, Suge, that you're the person behind the hit on Biggie.
Well, they looked at y'all and told y'all a fat-ass lie.
A reportedly missing photograph and former police chief Bernard Park's daughter came up during testimony today in the wrongful death lawsuit filed against the city by murdered rap star Biggie Smalls' mother.
That, to me, was probably another motive for Chief Parks to want to squash a lot of the information. There was an effort to keep a lot of the information away from the public.
This declaration from a jailhouse informant named Kenny Boagni links crooked LAPD officers David Mack and Rafael Perez to the murder of rap star Biggie Smalls.
Okay. Right? You see, Suge was willing to say, I didn't know those two cops, but maybe Reggie knew them.
Never met those dudes. They never worked for me. They knew Reggie right. They didn't know me.
He always would say, those are Reggie people.
And Reggie was fast to say, I didn't know them either.
I was just interested in why he would point the finger at Suge so quick. He wouldn't say it to you, but he definitely pointed it. We call that dry snitching.
That Perez told how he worked security for Death Row Records the night Biggie Smalls was assassinated, and how he and Mac used cell phones to set up the hit. Boagni now says he was instructed by an LAPD detective to share his story with no one else investigating Biggie's murder. Judge Florence Marie Cooper says LAPD may be involved in what she calls deliberate and intentional concealment of information. Jailhouse informant Kenny Boagni ties former LAPD officers David Mack and Rafael Perez to the murder of rap star Biggie Smalls. LAPD has withheld reams of other evidence as well, including at least 2 other jailhouse statements implicating dirty cops Mack and Perez in Biggie's murder. 1,000 pages of information were withheld describing Mack and Perez's involvement in Biggie's murder. 3 different jailhouse informants who offered to wear a wire were all turned down by LAPD. A wire, say informants, that could have caught jailed officer Perez boasting about his involvement with Death Row Records and the Biggie Smalls murder. Judge Florence Marie Cooper lists all the new information she says links former crooked LAPD officers David Mack and Rafael Perez to the murder of Biggie Smalls. The sheer volume of the information, says the judge, belies any LAPD argument that it comes from just another jailhouse informant.
Murder is pretty simple. The first person you go after is the spouse.
Perez and them was all involved. They were trying to kill me too, but see, because Perez and Reg was good friends, and Perez and Sarita and Reg is great friends, and so all those 3 together was trying to plot. Those guys, if you go back and watch the film, they was already stalking Pac, watching him. So that just tipped the iceberg when something happened. But there was a plan already to do something to him. Orlando wasn't even the shooter, you know? He was actually a good kid too, you know? I'm quite sure if they saw the first one, they would saw the second one, because it's the same circle of people.
You got a lot to cover up, y'all.
Freudian slip.
You got a lot to cover up.
Murder is pretty simple. The first person you go after is the spouse.
All the artists at Death Row was willing to come with me.
David Mack worked for you, right?
No, ma'am.
Never?
Never met him, never heard of him. Didn't know who he was until the accusations that he possibly did work for me. And that's been investigated by LAPD and all of that.
Why would I want a paper trail when I never brought him around nowhere? So if I'm gonna hide him in secret, you think I'm gonna let somebody catch a paper trail? They were paid cash by Snoop.
Perez and them was all involved. They were trying to kill me too, but see, because Perez and Reg was good friends, and Perez and Sarita and Reg is great friends, and so all those 3 together was trying to plot.
How about Rafael Perez?
Never heard of him until all the incidents happened.
go back and watch the film, they was already stalking Pac, watching him. So that just took the iceberg when something happened. But there was a plan already to do something to him.
So why does everyone keep telling me that David Mack was working for you?
Yeah. I never heard that.
You've never heard that?
That he worked for me.
You've never heard that?
Wait a minute. Let me clear that up. I'm saying by anyone that's credible that will work around there or anything. Like I said, that was all investigated by LAPD. I turned over my payroll, everything.
You always say those are Reggie people.
Orlando wasn't even the shooter, you know? He was actually a good kid, too, you know? I'm quite sure if they saw the first one, they would saw the second one, because it's the same circle of people.
You got a lot to cover up, y'all.
Freudian slip.
You got a lot to cover up.
It's the same people, same circle of people. It have nothing to do with me, you know?